The Bible is full of heroes who left a lasting legacy. Abraham had Isaac, who became the father of Jacob, and from him came the entire nation of Israel. David had Solomon, the wisest king in history. Even Joseph's descendants were remembered and honored. But when we look at Moses' son, something strange happens. If I asked you, who was Moses' son, would you know the answer? Most people don't even know his name. His name was Gershom, Moses' firstborn. And despite being the son of the man who freed Israel from Egypt, he simply vanishes from the biblical narrative. Why did this happen? 2. Understand this mystery, we need to go back to the beginning. Before Moses became Israel's great deliverer, he fled Egypt. After killing an Egyptian who was mistreating a Hebrew, Moses became a fugitive and found refuge in the land of Midian. There he met Jethro, the priest of Midian, and married his daughter Zipporah. From this union, Gershom was born, and his very name gives us clues about his destiny. The Bible says Moses named him Gershom because he felt like a foreigner in a foreign land. Exodus 2:22. The name Gershom comes from the Hebrew root ger, which means foreigner, stranger, someone without a true home. Think about that. From birth, Gershom carried the weight of exile. He wasn't born among the enslaved Hebrews in Egypt. He didn't grow up in Egyptian royalty like his adoptive grandfather Pharaoh. Gershom was born somewhere in between, a Hebrew raised among Midianites. That might seem like a minor detail, but in biblical culture, identity and lineage were everything, and Gershom didn't seem to belong anywhere. If we follow the biblical pattern, the firstborn son usually inherits the father's calling. Isaac inherited Abraham's blessing. Jacob inherited Isaac's promise. So why didn't Gershom inherit Moses' mission? If you think about it, he could have been a leader among the Levites. After all, Moses and Aaron were from the tribe of Levi. But instead, Gershom disappears from the story. His descendants are mentioned just once in the entire Bible, in 1 Chronicles 23:15-16, where it says Gershom had a son named Shebuel, but that's it. No major role. No legacy. Compare that to Aaron's sons, for example. It's shocking. Aaron, Moses' brother, had sons who became Israel's high priests, but Gershom's descendants? No significant impact on biblical history. Why? One possible reason could be how Gershom was raised. Moses spent 40 years in exile, away from the Hebrews. During that time, he wasn't teaching the Torah because it hadn't been given yet. He wasn't living among Israelites. He was in Midian, among a foreign people, raising his son in a culture that wasn't God's chosen nation. It's very possible that Gershom wasn't raised to be a leader of Israel, but rather a Midianite. Remember, Gershom's mother, Zipporah, was Midianite. And Midian wasn't part of God's covenant people. They believed in God, but not in the same way as the Israelites. That could have made Gershom feel disconnected from the spiritual and cultural identity of other Hebrew leaders. Sons, if that's the case, it makes sense that he never played a key role in Israel's history. He was never prepared for it. But there's something even more mysterious about this story, something that almost cost Moses his life. There's a bizarre episode in Exodus 4:24-26 where it says that God tried to kill Moses. Wait, what? Yes. Right after God appeared in the burning bush and commanded Moses to free Israel, something strange happens. As Moses is on his way to Egypt, the text says, "At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him." Exodus 4:24. That's shocking. God had just called Moses, but now he's trying to kill him. The answer to this mystery seems to be connected to Gershom. The next verse says that Zipporah took a sharp stone and circumcised their son. Then God spared Moses. What does this mean? It appears that Moses had not circumcised Gershom, even though circumcision was a required sign of God's covenant with his people. In other words, Moses was about to lead Israel to freedom, but he hadn't even followed God's command in his own household. And who notices this? Zipporah. She acts quickly, circumcising Gershom, then touches Moses' feet with the child's foreskin, and says something mysterious. "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." Exodus 4:25. What did she mean by that? This episode is so puzzling that many scholars believe it was a turning point for Gershom's fate. Perhaps this moment sealed Gershom's disconnection from Moses' mission. Gershom survived, but after this event, he disappears from the biblical story. When Moses leads the Hebrews through the wilderness, Gershom is nowhere to be found. When the priesthood is established, Gershom doesn't receive any significant role. It's as if, after this moment, Gershom's destiny was already decided. But there's still more to uncover. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into who Gershom really was, and whether the Bible left hidden clues about his fate. The answer might just surprise you. If Gershom was Moses' firstborn son, why does the Bible barely mention him? If you've read the stories of David, Jacob, or even Samuel, you know that the sons of great biblical leaders always played an important role, whether for good or bad. But Gershom, he's mentioned only twice in the entire Bible, with no explanation about his fate. That raises an intriguing question. Was his name intentionally erased? Now, let's dig into the little we know about Gershom and try to piece together this lost puzzle of history. If we open the Bible and look for Gershom, we'll find just two direct references to him. Exodus 2:22, where Moses names his son and says, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." Chronicles 23:15-16, where it simply states that Gershom had a son named Shebuel. And that's it. No mention of his deeds, achievements, or any significant role in Israel's history. But there's another mysterious clue hidden elsewhere in the Bible that might reveal more about Gershom. And it's found in the book of Judges. There's a puzzling verse in Judges that might be linked to Gershom. It talks about a young Levite who became a priest for the tribe of Dan, but in a completely corrupt way. Here's the verse. The Danites set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. Judges 18:30. Wait a second. Gershom. If this Gershom is the same Gershom we're talking about, then we're looking at something shocking. His grandson, Jonathan, became an idolatrous priest. But there's something strange here. If you check some Bible translations, instead of saying son of Moses, some versions say son of Manasseh. What's going on? Jewish scribes noticed something unusual in Judges 18:30. In the original Hebrew text, the name Manasseh is written in a peculiar way. The letter N, Nun, is placed above the line, almost like it was added later. This led scholars to believe that the original name was actually Moses, but that ancient scribes deliberately altered it to say Manasseh. Why? Because they didn't want to associate Moses, the greatest leader of Israel, with a grandson who became an idolatrous priest. If this is true, then we've uncovered something shocking. Gershom might have been the father of a man who led Israel into idolatry. And if Moses' grandson really became an idolatrous priest, that raises an even deeper question. What went wrong in Moses' household? Remember, Moses was raised in Egypt, far from the Hebrews. Then he spent 40 years living among the Midianites. During that time he married Zipporah and had Gershom. If Gershom grew up in a Midianite environment, he may have never truly developed a strong connection to the Hebrew faith, and that would have consequences. If Gershom didn't pass down the true faith to his son Jonathan, that would explain why Jonathan later went astray and became a priest of idolatry for the tribe of Dan. But it also means Gershom's erasure from the Bible might have been intentional. If Gershom really had a son who became an idolatrous priest, then the Bible's silence about him makes a lot of sense. Hebrew culture placed tremendous importance on spiritual legacy, And if Gershom's legacy was a grandson who led people into idolatry, then it's no surprise that his story was left out. We see this pattern elsewhere in the Bible. For example, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, committed a grave sin by offering unauthorized fire before God, Leviticus 10. As a result, they were struck dead on the spot. The same thing happened with Saul's descendants. They were quickly removed from power after his disastrous reign. In other words, the Bible tends not to highlight those who failed spiritually, and Gershom might be another case of that. Another mystery about Gershom is that none of his descendants ever took a leadership role in Israel. Compare that to Aaron. His sons became Israel's high priests for generations, but Moses' sons, nothing. Why? The reason might lie in Moses himself. Remember, for most of his life, Moses wasn't with his family. He spent 40 years in the desert with Jethro, then 40 years leading Israel through the Exodus. That means Gershom didn't grow up by his father's side. Maybe he never had real spiritual discipleship. And if Jonathan, his son, really did become an idolatrous priest, then Gershom's spiritual detachment becomes even more obvious. Which leads us to the biggest question of all. After Moses returned to Egypt, we never hear him talk about Gershom. He talks about his mission, about Israel, about Aaron, but never about his son. Did Moses realize too late that he had failed to raise Gershom in the right way? Did he, at the end of his life, look back and realize that even though he freed an entire nation, he failed to pass down his legacy to his own children? If that's the case, this is one of the most powerful lessons we can learn from Gershom's story. After all, what's the point of gaining the whole world if you lose your own family? In the next chapter, we'll dive into the strangest moment in this entire story. The moment when God almost killed Moses because of Gershom. You won't want to miss this. Of all the strange moments in Moses' life, one of the most unsettling is when God tries to kill him. Wait, what? Yep. In Exodus 4:24-26, we find one of the most cryptic episodes in the Bible. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. Exodus 4:24, the same God who had just called Moses to free Israel was now trying to take him out. And the weirdest part? The situation only gets resolved when Zipporah, Moses' wife, circumcises Gershom. What is going on here? In this chapter, we're going to dig deep into this bizarre event and uncover the real meaning behind this shocking moment. To understand this passage, we need to look at what happened before. Moses was living a quiet life in Midian, tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, when, out of nowhere, God appeared to him in the burning bush. There, God gave Moses a clear mission: go back to Egypt and free the Israelites. Moses hesitated. He made excuses. He even said he wasn't a good speaker, but God didn't take no for an answer. So Moses finally agreed and set off for Egypt with his wife Zipporah and their sons. And that's when something unexpected happened. On the way, God tried to kill him. But why? The Bible doesn't explain it directly, but the details give us some clues. Zipporah, seeing what was happening, quickly grabbed a sharp stone, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it, saying, "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." Exodus 4:25. And just like that, God spared Moses. That gives us a clear hint. The problem was Gershom and the fact that he wasn't circumcised. Ever since the time of Abraham, God had commanded that every male among his people must be circumcised on the 8th day of life. "This is my covenant, that you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." The Genesis 17:10. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant between God and Israel. But Moses, the man God had chosen to lead Israel, hadn't obeyed this command with his own son. Think about that. How could Moses demand that the Israelites follow God's laws if he himself wasn't obeying? This moment reveals something huge. Before God could use Moses to change a nation, he first required Moses to set things right in his own house. If circumcision was such a critical command, why had Moses neglected it? The answer might lie in Midianite culture. Zipporah, Moses' wife, was the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. The Midianites believed in God, but they didn't follow the same covenant as the Israelites. It's possible that Zipporah objected to circumcising Gershom, and maybe, to avoid conflict, Moses gave in to his wife's wishes. But now, as he was stepping into God's calling, that compromise couldn't be ignored anymore. Moses had to choose, fully commit to God's covenant or continue compromising. Someone might ask, did God really need to go that far? Yes, and here's why. Moses' calling was too great to be taken lightly. If Moses was going to lead Israel, he had to be in complete obedience. Circumcision was the symbol of God's covenant. If Moses wasn't willing to enforce it in his own family, how could he lead God's family? This principle shows up throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, Paul wrote to Timothy about spiritual leadership. If someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? 1 Timothy 3:5. The same applied to Moses. God was making it crystal clear. Moses couldn't lead Israel unless he first walked in full obedience himself. One interesting detail here is that Zipporah was the one who circumcised Gershom. This suggests that Moses was either hesitant, confused, or even incapacitated by God's attack. But Zipporah acted fast. She immediately recognized that the issue was circumcision, and even though she didn't like it, she did what had to be done. However, her reaction afterward is telling. She threw the foreskin at Moses' feet and said, "Surely, you are a husband of blood to me." That phrase suggests frustration and anger. Maybe she felt forced to do something she strongly disagreed with. Maybe this moment created a rift in their marriage. In fact, this is the last time we see Zipporah by Moses' side. After this episode, it seems like Moses sent her back to her father's house. She only reappears much later when Jethro brings her back to Moses in the wilderness, Exodus 18:2. This means this event may have separated Moses from his family for a while. This bizarre event teaches us a powerful truth. Moses was about to step into the greatest calling of his life. But before leading a nation, God required him to first get his own house in order. This shows us that partial obedience isn't enough. Moses had already said yes to God, but he still wasn't in full obedience. Our family must align with our calling. Moses couldn't lead Israel if his own household wasn't following God's covenant. God takes our obedience seriously. This event proves that God doesn't accept excuses when it comes to his commands. But now comes the big question. If this event was so important, why did Gershom continue to disappear from history? Did this moment seal his fate? Did Moses lose his own son because of this mistake? In the next chapter, we're going to explore what happened after this shocking event and why Gershom never became a leader in Israel. The answer might be more impactful than you expect. What happened to Gershom after that terrifying moment when God almost killed Moses? As the firstborn son of Moses, he should have played a major role in Israel's history. After all, he was the direct descendant of the man who led God's people out of slavery in Egypt. But surprisingly, we never hear about Gershom again. Why did he die young? Did he walk away from Israel? Or was his story intentionally erased? In this chapter, we're going to examine the clues left in the Bible and try to understand why Gershom never became a leader and how his legacy faded into history. The last time Gershom is directly mentioned in the biblical narrative is in that strange event in Exodus 4:24-26, when Zipporah circumcises him to save Moses from death. After that, total silence. He doesn't appear among the Levites who helped carry the tabernacle. He isn't mentioned during Israel's journey through the wilderness. He isn't even there when Moses gives his final speech to the people. If Moses was one of the greatest leaders in biblical history, why did his own son vanish? There's an interesting theory that suggests Gershom might have never left Egypt with Moses. We know that right after the circumcision incident, Moses sent his wife and children away. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, along with her 2 sons. Exodus 18:2. This means that while Moses was confronting Pharaoh, performing miracles, and leading the Israelites out of Egypt, his wife and children weren't there. They were with Jethro in Midian. That raises a fascinating question. Did Gershom grow up away from the people of Israel? If Gershom spent most of his youth in Midian, far from the Israelites, then he may have never fully identified with God's people. And that may have sealed his fate. Even his name was prophetic. Moses named his son Gershom, saying, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." Exodus 2:22. And that foreign identity seems to have stayed with him forever. He was born outside of Egypt, raised among Midianites, and may have never developed a sense of belonging among the Israelites. And that could explain why he never became a leader. In biblical culture, leaders didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were shaped within the community, immersed in the faith, traditions, and calling of God. But Gershom, growing up in a different environment, may have never fully connected to his father's mission. When we compare Gershom's story to that of Aaron's sons, the difference is shocking. Aaron, Moses' brother, had sons who became Israel's high priests for generations. Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar inherited the priesthood and played major roles in Israel's spiritual leadership. But Moses' sons, nothing. They weren't spiritual leaders. They weren't influential Levites. They weren't judges, prophets, or kings. It's as if Moses' legacy ended with him. This brings up a difficult question. Did Moses fail to raise his own son in the ways of God? If we analyze Moses' life, one pattern stands out. He spent most of his life away from his family. First 40 years, raised in Pharaoh's palace, far from the Hebrews. Next 40 years, exiled in Midian, far from the Israelites. Last 40 years, leading Israel through the wilderness, far from his own home. Moses was always away from someone, and that pattern may have impacted the way he raised his sons. If Gershom spent most of his childhood with Jethro, without strong influence from Moses, then he might have never been discipled the way Joshua was. While Joshua was at Moses' side being trained as a leader, Gershom was missing. And this teaches us something deep. A leader can change the world, but if they're absent at home, they might lose their own family. Even though Gershom himself was forgotten in history, we do know he had a son named Shebuel. 1 Chronicles 23:16. But there's a disturbing detail. In the previous chapter we explored Judges 18:30, where we find a man named Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, who became an idolatrous priest for the tribe of Dan. If Gershom and Gershon are the same person, as some scholars suggest, then Moses' grandson abandoned the faith and led others into idol worship. That would make Gershom's disappearance even more significant. His descendants didn't inherit Moses' mission. They strayed from God completely. And maybe that's why the Bible erased Gershom's story. Gershom's disappearance from Scripture holds some profound lessons. God's calling isn't automatic. Just because Moses was a great leader didn't mean his sons would automatically inherit his purpose. Spiritual identity matters. Gershom grew up feeling like an outsider, and that may have shaped his destiny. Absent parents leave gaps. Moses transformed history, but he may have missed the opportunity to disciple his own sons. The Bible's silence is intentional. If Gershom was left out of Scripture, it may be God's way of reminding us that true legacy isn't about a name, it's about faithfulness. In the next chapter, we'll dive into what this mystery teaches us today and how we can avoid making the same mistakes Moses might have made. The answer might change the way you think about legacy and faith. The Bible is full of stories that seem simple at first glance, but actually hide deep and mysterious truths. The disappearance of Gershom from the biblical narrative was no accident. God could have included more details about him, but he didn't. That means there's something bigger behind this silence. In this final chapter, we're going to unpack the spiritual meaning of this mystery and discover what it teaches us even today. In Scripture, when someone's name is forgotten or erased, it often has a spiritual meaning. For example, Lucifer lost his place among the faithful angels. The spies who doubted God, except Joshua and Caleb, were never remembered. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, was replaced by Matthias. So what does it mean that Gershom was forgotten? It might represent something much bigger, the loss of a spiritual opportunity. As Moses' firstborn, Gershom should have inherited a great mission, but instead he vanished. Gershom's disappearance reminds us of other biblical figures who missed their moment. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. Eli's sons lost the priesthood because of their disobedience. The rich young ruler refused to follow Jesus because he loved his wealth too much. All of these men had huge opportunities, but let them slip away. And Gershom, he might have been one more name on that list. Here's the real question. Was this Gershom's choice, or was it God's plan? If we look at the Bible, we see a pattern. God always chooses the faithful to carry his mission forward. He chose Jacob over Esau. He chose David over his older brothers. He chose Samuel instead of Eli's sons. That means if Gershom had a heart for God, he would have been used. But the fact that he left no spiritual legacy suggests one of two things. God didn't choose him. He never wanted to be chosen. Either way, the result was the same. Gershom's name faded into history. One key reason Gershom wasn't used by God could be where he was during the Exodus. The sons of Aaron became priests because they were with Moses during Israel's deliverance. They saw the plagues in Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea. They received God's law at Mount Sinai. But Gershom, he wasn't there. That means that when God was forming a new generation of leaders, Gershom wasn't part of it. This reveals a powerful spiritual truth. Not everyone born in a faith-filled environment is part of God's purpose. Gershom was born into the family of Moses. He was the son of one of the greatest prophets in history, but that wasn't enough. The Bible makes it clear that faith isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose. That's why Jesus said, "If anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Matthew 16:24. It doesn't matter who your parents are or where you came from. What matters is your personal decision to follow God. Gershom may have grown up surrounded by Moses' faith, but that doesn't mean he chose to walk the same path. This is a serious warning for our generation. Today, many people grow up in Christian homes, but never truly experience God. They know about the Bible, they go to church, they hear the stories, but they never develop a personal faith. And what happens? They grow up and walk away. That might be exactly what happened to Gershom. He was so distant from God's movement that when Israel was being transformed, he wasn't there to be part of it. So here's the question we need to ask ourselves. Are we living a real faith? Or just inheriting a tradition? Because if our faith is just a routine, it won't last. That's exactly what happened to Gershom, and it can happen to us too. Let's take this a step further. Gershom's vanishing act may have a prophetic message behind it. In the Bible, there are two spiritual lineages, those who are part of God's covenant and carry his purpose. Those who, through their choices, are cut off from the story of redemption. Gershom might symbolize people who have the chance to live for God but waste their opportunity. That's a wake-up call for all of us. God is calling us to be part of his story. But it's our decision to accept or ignore that call. What will you choose? The story of Gershom teaches us three powerful truths. God's calling isn't automatic. Being raised in a faith-filled home doesn't guarantee a spiritual legacy. You have to choose it for yourself. If you're not present in God's movement, you might be forgotten spiritually. Gershom wasn't there for the Exodus, so when God chose the next generation of leaders, he was left out. The greatest tragedy isn't failure, it's spiritual irrelevance. Gershom wasn't remembered because he didn't make an impact in God's kingdom. Now it's your turn. So now the question is, what about you? How do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be someone who plays a role in God's plan, or just another name forgotten in history? The choice is yours. Gershom's story is a silent yet powerful warning. He was Moses' son, but that didn't guarantee his spiritual future. And that leads us to the final question. How do you want to be remembered? The truth is, not everyone who gets the chance to make history chooses to seize it. He was born into Moses' household. He could have been a leader. He could have inherited his father's mission, but he didn't. His name faded into history because, spiritually, he didn't make a difference. And the same can happen to any of us. The choice is still in your hands. God is writing an incredible story, and he wants you to be part of it. But it's up to you to decide, will you step into your calling, or will you disappear like Gershom? Even today, God is still calling people to carry out his purpose. The question is, will you answer the call, or will you let the opportunity slip away? The choice is yours. Enjoyed this study? Let's keep the conversation going. If you like this, don't forget to like, comment, and share. And if you want to uncover more hidden mysteries in the Bible, check out this other video on our channel. See you in the next one, and may God bless you abundantly.